Hello, this is Leslie from GDPR Advisors. One of the questions we get asked quite a bit is whether somebody needs a data protection officer, and if they do, what does the data protection officer do? So there are certain conditions in the legislation that would require you to appoint a data protection officer, and they are if you're a public authority or body, so except for courts acting in their judicial capacity, or if your core activities require large-scale, regular and systematic monitoring of individuals, for example online behaviour tracking, or your core activities consist of large-scale processing of special categories of data or data relating to criminal convictions and offences. Large-scale is not defined, but they've given some clues as to what large-scale would be. And what they say is a hospital is processing on a large scale, but a doctor is not. So when you think about how many patients a doctor would have and how many patients a hospital would have, you can see there's quite a variance in it. So if you have a lot of people that you are monitoring in some way, so you're reviewing them or you're checking something or you're looking at the way they interact with your business, then you would probably need a data protection officer. Or if you are looking at special category information on a large scale, then you would need a data protection officer. You can appoint a data protection officer even if you aren't required to, but remember that there is a legislative element to a data protection officer and they would have to meet that requirement. What does a DPO do? So a data protection officer should have the professional qualities, experience and knowledge to be able to lead your data protection function, provide advice, provide training, etc. It's also a good idea if they have knowledge of your industry or your sector, because they can bring that experience into your organisation. They don't have to be a full-time data protection officer, and if you don't want a full-time data protection officer, there are lots of consultancies that will provide data protection officer duties for you. The data protection officer should inform and advise you and any employees about your obligations to comply with the UK GDPR and other data protection laws. It doesn't matter whether you're a small business or a big business. If you are required to appoint a data protection officer, you need to do it. So if you meet the large scale monitoring, then you need to appoint a data protection officer, even if there's only 2 or 3 of you in your business. The data protection officer should also monitor compliance with data protection laws and data protection policies, update them, manage internal data protection activities, raise awareness of data protection issues, train staff, conduct internal audits. Their whole aim of the data protection officer is to make sure you stay up to date with legislation, that your policies reflect your good practice, that your staff are trained on a regular basis, that they have data protection impact assessments completed when they're required. The data protection officer will also cooperate with the supervisory body, and generally they're the first point of contact for individuals who want to find out more about how their information is used within your organisation. The data protection officer is required to take into account the risk associated with the processing, and they'll focus more on the more risky activities. So they'll think about the nature, scope and context of your processing. The data protection officer also has to be independent of the processing that's happening, so there isn't a conflict of interest in the way that they work within the business. That can sometimes be a bit tricky to implement if you're a small organisation. And if your data protection officer, who reports to the highest level in your organisation, provides advice and you choose not to take it, as an organisation you would need to document the reasons that you didn't to demonstrate the accountability for not following their advice. So data protection officer, you may not need one. If you need one, they should be appropriately skilled and experienced. They should be independent of the processing, report to the highest level of management, and be responsible for all data protection activities within your organisation. But what happens if you don't need a data protection officer? So if you don't meet the requirements, you don't necessarily need to appoint someone. And I would advise that you don't appoint a data protection officer. But that doesn't mean you can't have a person who has more knowledge in your organisation to lead the data protection function. Just don't call them a data protection officer. You want to call them a data protection lead or a data protection champion, a privacy lead. They do not meet the requirements of a data protection officer, so do not call them that. But you'll also need to keep under review the need for a data protection officer in case the way your business works or the level of information that your business collects changes and you do become eligible for a data protection officer. So if you don't need a DPO, don't call someone it, but keep it under review in case business changes. If you've got specific questions or you need help with appointing a data protection officer, then drop us an email and we'll be happy to help.